Everywhere you look, you will see the headlines. Kids these days don't know how to read. Literacy is on the decline, kids don't read for pleasure anymore, and some want to say that we are living through a literacy crisis. You'll even see some claim that 40% of American kids can't read. That's not true, by the way, and we're going to talk about that later in this video. Are we living through a literacy crisis, or is this just a long-standing failure dressed up as something new? If you want to understand the American literacy crisis, you need to know three numbers. First up, 40%. That's the percentage of American fourth graders who cannot read at what's called a basic level. Every few years, students around the country take a test called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the NAEP. This is also sometimes called the nation's report card, and it allows us to track educational progress throughout the country. Reading scores have remained relatively stable since 1992 until 2019, when they started to decline. Sometimes that's reported as saying that 40% of students can't read, but that's not what those statistics mean. So now 40% of fourth graders can't read at what's considered a basic level, and only 31% can read at what's considered a proficient level. The NAEP also defines those terms, and just because a kid can't read at basic level doesn't mean that they can't read. But the literacy crisis doesn't stop at elementary schools, and that brings us to our second number, 28%. That's the share of US adults that are at the lowest level of literacy. In the last decade, that number has increased by 9 points. This doesn't mean that those adults can't read, but it does mean that they are what's called functionally illiterate. This means that they lack literacy skills which would allow them to navigate the world and go about their day-to-day task. And our final number is 21. That's Mississippi's ranking in fourth grade literacy as of 2022. In 2013, Mississippi was ranked 49th. They were basically at the bottom of the country's rankings, and now they are well above the middle. And that's because they saw the problem and they actually tried to solve it. So at the end of this video, we're going to talk about what Mississippi has done right. But first, we're going to take a slightly closer look at that NAEP data. Literacy scores have been declining since 2019. This might not be that surprising because something rather big happened in 2020, which caused a lot of school closures, and we've generally seen learning loss across the board. Absenteeism is also up post-COVID, which does complicate actually teaching kids how to read. One group of student hasn't seen a decline in their test scores though. These are students who are already in the 90th percentile. So what we're seeing is a widening gap between those students who are reading quite well and those students who are struggling to read at a basic level. This tells us something important. If we want to improve American literacy, the biggest impact we can have is by focusing on those students who are struggling to read the most. And that's going to be important when we talk about Mississippi in a few minutes. But even those top performing students, like the students who would go on to study at really great colleges and universities, are also struggling. At the University of Texas here in Austin, some professors told their school newspaper that they would be shortening reading assignments and transitioning to assigning things like YouTube videos and audiobooks instead of physical books because students simply didn't have the patience for the reading assignments anymore. One professor was told by his students that Shakespeare's Hamlet was too long to read. Now, Hamlet is the longest Shakespeare play, but it is about 30,000 words. It's much shorter than the vast majority of novels out there. These professors cited things like the rise of video content, but also phone usage as leading to a decline in their students' reading abilities. But they've decided that they have to give in and change with the times so that they can meet their students where they are. That same professor who was told that Hamlet was too long, he used to teach 10 plays per semester. He's now teaching 6 in his classes. So even college students at good schools are struggling to read, and many of them are going to become adults who hardly read at all. Many Americans simply don't read books, and I think about 10% of college graduates haven't read a book in the last year. They don't know how to read, and maybe that's because they haven't been taught how to be a good reader. All right, let's pause for a second and ask ourselves what it means to be a good reader. The psychologist Daniel Willingham has this book called The Reading Mind, and in this book, he points out that reading is actually a fairly demanding task. First, you have to be able to understand the words on the page, and that's usually what we mean when we say that we're teaching kids to read. But actually, reading involves 3 additional levels of representation. You need to be able to extract ideas from sentences, you need to be able to then connect the idea across those sentences, and then you integrate this within a model in your mind that answers the question of what the text is about. And Willingham notes that many readers fail at the second level. They're not able to point out obvious contradictions in a paragraph that they read. If you're not reading at a level where you could even catch obvious contradictions, then you're going to struggle when you're reading sets of instructions or complicated forms. And really that contributes to what we called functional illiteracy before. That's that illiteracy that makes it difficult for you to navigate your day-to-day life. Being able to connect ideas is actually a skill that you have to develop. And I found that when I was teaching philosophy at some universities, that skill was something that my college students still needed to develop. I found that the worst question I could possibly ask when I started a discussion of some text in the classroom was, what is this text about? Because most students could tell you what some of the sentences said, but they weren't able to form a picture of the cohesive whole. That meant that I had to guide them through interpreting a text. I would have to ask them questions like, what is the thesis of this article or this book or whatever it was that we were reading? Where are the arguments and the evidence for that thesis? And then is there any irrelevant or unnecessary information in the text? This was a process that I would guide my students through so that they could learn how to read better. But there was another barrier that my students faced, which is that they lacked a lot of background knowledge, which helped them make sense of a text. Let's say you want to read a really big book like War and Peace. Well, War and Peace is a historical novel. It is set in a particular time and place. You don't need to know all of the historical details in order to make sense of War and Peace, but having some idea of European history and maybe France's connection to Russia, knowing who people like Napoleon or Louis XVI are, these are things that would be useful for you as you're reading. It would make reading War and Peace a less demanding task. And I found that a lot of my students lacked historical knowledge or just general world knowledge, which would make reading books easier. I think part of this has to do with the fact that at some point we started to emphasize critical thinking over memorization of facts. You can find this a lot in popular discussions of pedagogy. The idea is that you should teach students how to think rather than what to think. And there's some truth to that. But I think there's a crucial error that's being made there, which is that actually learning about the world and learning facts about the world goes hand in hand with learning how to think critically, because it allows you to build a mental model of the world and you can see where new facts might fit in or where they actually contradict things that you should already know. Critical thinking and memorization might actually go hand in hand, and they help us to produce better readers. Now, some experts do not want to call this a crisis. One researcher from Harvard University described American reading education as a very stable level of mediocrity. We've never done a great job, and things have been getting a little bit worse, but this isn't new, and it's certainly not unprecedented. And there is a lot of fear-mongering about this. Let me tell you about the National Literacy Institute. If you've seen those headlines I mentioned about American literacy, there's a chance that you've seen statistics from this website. For instance, you might have heard that 21% of American adults are illiterate. But actually look at the website, and I'll put a link down below as well. There's no explanation for that number, about 21% of American adults being illiterate. No definition is also given of what they mean by illiterate. And the numbers you find on this website are painting a much worse picture than the numbers that you find elsewhere. I actually emailed the National Literacy Institute to ask them where they got these numbers and if they could explain some of them to me, but I did not hear back. And if that changes between the time of recording and the time of posting, I will issue a correction. I'd be happy to do it. But some fact checkers reached out to the NLI in 2024, and they also never heard back. Those fact checkers concluded that the NLI was using an overly expansive definition of illiterate. They were also misdescribing the data that they were citing, and they were misleadingly describing their data as new, when in fact, this data does not come out on an annual basis. National Literacy Institute is just another name for the National Literacy Professional Development Consortium. That's a private company that sells professional development courses for teachers. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, teachers often need more professional development as they further their careers. But the fact that they call themselves the National Literacy Institute sometimes makes it seem like they're a research center, and it gives a lot of authority to the things that they put on their website. And I've noticed that people will cite this website uncritically. I've even seen other YouTubers cite this when they talk about American literacy. I don't think those YouTubers were trying to mislead you. I think that they had the best intentions, but I think they got fooled. But seriously, look at the website again. There's no sources. There's no research methods. There's nothing like that. It's just bullet points and numbers. Where did the numbers come from? Well, the website doesn't tell you. I think anyone honestly looking at this data would say that there is a real problem with literacy in America. But we have to be able to say that there's a problem without engaging in fear-mongering or simply lying about it. Fear-mongering might even give you the impression that this is a problem that can't be solved. And that's not true. Like I mentioned before, some states have started to find solutions, like Mississippi. Between 2013 and 2022, Mississippi students dramatically improved their reading scores. This was a period where most states saw a decline. This was such a dramatic improvement that some commentators started calling this the Mississippi miracle. But it's not a miracle, it's just good policy. Because one researcher from the University of Toronto found that this improvement was linked to the Literacy-Based Promotion Act, or the LBPA. The Mississippi legislature passed the LBPA in 2013, and that bill did a couple of things. It expanded access to full-day pre-K programs. It focused education on phonics and the science of reading, so it actually changed how we were teaching students how to read. It invested in professional development for teachers because they would need more training. It identified struggling readers and then targeted them for specific interventions. So if a student was falling behind, they got additional help when it came to reading. And finally, some struggling third graders were held back for a year so that they would have more time to build their reading skills. The simple description, though, is that the LBPA took literacy seriously. It gave teachers the training they needed, it focused on struggling readers, and it gave kids time to learn how to read properly. So the LBPA had a very strong impact on those students at the bottom. It helped bring a lot of students from that below basic category to basic, and also students from basic to proficient. It had almost no impact on students who were already proficient, maybe moving them to the advanced category. But that's to be expected given the kind of interventions that were in the bill. What Mississippi demonstrated is that the decline in American literacy isn't inevitable. We can solve this problem, and it actually only cost Mississippi $15 million. That sounds like a really big number, but the state's budget is $7.6 billion, so we are talking about fractions here. This doesn't solve every problem. There are still adults in the United States who are functionally illiterate. There are plenty of adults who can read but simply choose not to, and we still need to figure out what to do about college students who can't keep up with assigned reading anymore. But Mississippi's success shows that the literacy crisis can be mitigated. We can help more people learn to read if we're smart about it. Before we go, let me ask you one question. Are you looking for a way to learn more and to stop mindlessly scrolling? Or do you want to have a healthier relationship with your phone and to use your screen time wisely? Well, if that's the case, then you should check out Imprint. Imprint is a beautifully illustrated and animated learning app. They've built a highly visual and effective learning experience that's all based on bite-sized learning. They were named by Apple as one of the top educational apps, and they were generous enough to sponsor this video. Imprint is a way for you to learn about topics like philosophy or psychology or the science of happiness. And along the way, it's helping you build a daily learning habit. In fact, it only takes a few minutes per day. It is designed so that you only need to spend 2 minutes on the app in order to get the best experience. So it's easy to fit Imprint into your busy schedule. One of the most popular courses over on Imprint is Essential Philosophy, Theories and Thinkers. This is a month-long philosophy course that was written by an actual university professor. This course touches on some of the most important philosophers and ideas throughout history, starting all the way back with Plato and Socrates. To try everything that Imprint has to offer for free for a full 7 days, you can scan the QR code, which is on the screen right now, or you can go to the link down in the description. The first 200 of you will get 20% off an Imprint annual subscription.